The war was ending, though in the dim corridors of the field hospital no one dared to say it aloud. The air was heavy with the smell of disinfectant, sweat, and blood. Outside, artillery thundered in the distance, rattling windows in their frames, a grim metronome marking the Reich's collapse. For the nurses inside, every hour blurred into the next. Their days were measured not in calendars, but in wounds, shattered bones, gangrenous limbs, fevered whispers from boys who looked more like schoolchildren than soldiers. They worked with dwindling supplies, boiling bandages for reuse, fashioning splints from scraps of wood. Their hands never stopped moving, even when their own bodies screamed for rest. These women had been trained as healers. Some had entered nursing schools before the war, eager to serve their communities. Others had been drafted into service, pressed into uniforms as the Reich expanded its demands. All had been told the same thing. Their duty was sacred, their service a contribution to Germany's 1,000-year future. Yet by 1945, the future had shrunk to a few desperate days. Rumors filtered into the wards on hushed lips. American forces were advancing across the Rhine. Entire divisions had surrendered. Towns fell without resistance. The Reich, which had once promised triumph, was collapsing faster than anyone could comprehend. The nurses heard these rumors and said nothing, but their hands trembled as they dressed wounds. They had been told what capture meant. Leaflets from Goebbels' propaganda ministry were explicit. American soldiers would not show mercy. Nurses would be humiliated, punished, perhaps worse. Stories circulated that women in occupied towns were paraded through the streets, shorn of their hair, spat upon and cast aside as collaborators. For German nurses whose uniforms bore the insignia of service to the Reich, the fear was sharper synced, ill. They were not civilians, not neutral. They had worked in military hospitals, tended to soldiers who fought Americans tooth and nail. They believed their fates were sealed. Elizabeth Bauer, 27, had been a nurse since 1939. She remembered the early days of the war, when German victories filled newspapers, when wounded soldiers spoke with confidence that they would soon return to the front. Now she walked the wards in silence, listening to delirious boys whispering for mothers they would never see again. She rationed morphine drop by drop, knowing there was never enough. At night she lay awake on her cot, staring at the ceiling beams, imagining the moment the Americans would burst through the doors. She was not alone in her fear. Helga Müller, barely 20, confessed one night in the break room, her voice shaking. "They will punish us. For every wound we tended, for every soldier we saved, they will say our hands are guilty." No one contradicted her. The silence was agreement. As winter turned to spring, the pressure grew unbearable. Supplies dwindled further. Bread rations shrank to crusts. Soap vanished. The nurses washed their hands with cold water that never seemed to rinse the blood away. They stole moments to cry in storage closets, muffling sobs into their sleeves. Yet still they worked, because to stop was unthinkable. The wounded needed them, and work was the only shield against despair. Then the day came when thunder moved closer. It began with a tremor underfoot, a vibration that shook instruments on shelves. The guns were no longer distant, they were here. Shells landed in the outskirts of the town, shattering glass, sending clouds of plaster dust through the halls. Wards filled with screams, not from new wounds, but from terror. Doctors shouted orders, moving frantically between patients. Nurses scrambled to secure bandages, medicines, stretcher. Or so, the hospital was a hive of panic, the certainty of defeat pressing down on every soul within its walls. By evening, the truth could no longer be denied. The German soldiers who had guarded the perimeter were gone. Some fled, others deserted. The staff gathered in the main hall, the silence punctuated by distant gunfire. "They are coming," whispered one of the older nurses. Her voice was flat, resigned. No one spoke after that. The nurses moved back to their wards, their feet heavy, their hands cold. They tended to the wounded mechanically, though their thoughts were far away. Each imagined the same scene: doors bursting open, foreign boots on the floorboards, rifles pointed at their chests. Humiliation, revenge, the end of everything. That night was endless. Outside, engines rumbled. Shouts in foreign tongues drifted through shattered windows. The town was falling, house by house. Elizabeth sat at a patient's bedside, holding the hand of a boy barely 16. His fever burned through his body, his breath rattling. She knew he would not live to see the morning. Tears blurred her vision. She thought of her own younger brother, lost on the Eastern Front, and wondered if he had died in a stranger's arms like this. When dawn came, it arrived with steel. The Americans were at the gates. Engines roared as trucks rolled into the courtyard. Boots pounded cobblestones. Shouts echoed down corridors. The nurses stiffened as doors swung open, sunlight flooding in behind the silhouettes of armed men. The moment they had dreaded was here. They braced for revenge. The first American soldiers stepped into the ward with rifles raised, scanning the room. Their uniforms were dusty, their helmets scuffed, their eyes sharp with fatigue. For a heartbeat, time froze. Every German nurse stiffened, their hands half raised, their faces pale with dread. The wounded groaned, some whispering prayers, others shutting their eyes against what they thought was coming. Elizabeth Bauer felt her breath seize in her chest. This was it, the humiliation, the punishment they had been promised. She braced herself for shouting, for the tearing of uniforms, for some cruel spectacle of vengeance. But it did not come. Instead, one of the Americans, a sergeant with mud on his boots and a Red Cross armband strapped over his sleeve, lowered his rifle slightly. His voice was firm, but not cruel. "Nurses?" The interpreter behind him repeated the word in German. The women nodded hesitantly. The sergeant scanned the ward, taking in the rows of wounded. His expression shifted. Not triumph, not cruelty, but recognition. The look of a man who had seen too many battlefields, too many broken bodies. He gave a quick order. Within minutes, American medics streamed in, setting down crates, bandages, bottles of medicine, tins of food. The German nurses blinked in disbelief. Supplies. Real, untouched supplies. Gauze that was white, not yellowed from boiling. Morphine vials unopened, still glistening with condensation. Bars of soap, fresh and sharp-scented. The first words spoken to them were not threats, but orders. "You will keep working. You will treat these men, German and American." The women stared, confused. Helga Müller whispered, "They want us to keep nursing?" She could hardly believe it. They had expected to be stripped of duty, reduced to prisoners. Instead, the Americans were telling them to do the only thing they knew: heal. The transformation began that very day. German nurses found themselves working side by side with American medics. At first, the collaboration was stiff. The women flinched whenever an American passed too close. Their hands trembled as they accepted new bandages, their eyes darting for signs of mockery. Yet none came. The Americans moved with brisk efficiency, as if this cooperation were the most natural thing in the world. By evening, German and American doctors were leaning over the same operating tables. A wound. The German soldier cried out as shrapnel was pulled from his side. Elizabeth, who had been holding his hand, looked up and met the gaze of an American medic across the table. He nodded once, an unspoken acknowledgement. Pain was pain, and a nurse's touch was universal. The next day, more Red Cross parcels arrived. The crates opened to reveal treasures the women had nearly forgotten: sanitary pads, toothbrushes, combs, soap that foamed easily. Some parcels even contained lipstick, small tins of cocoa, packets of sugar. The German nurses exchanged bewildered glances. This was not humiliation, it was abundance. One nurse, Anna Richter, held a bar of soap to her face and wept. She had not smelled that clean scent in years. Another, Greta Klein, ran her fingers over a box of fresh bandages, whispering, "How many lives we might have saved if we'd had these months ago." Slowly, disbelief gave way to astonishment. The Americans were not only allowing them to continue their work, they were treating them as colleagues. The propaganda that had filled their ears for years, claims that Americans were brutes, degenerates, racially impure, crumbled with every shared operation, every respectful word. It was not just the supplies that stunned them. It was the diversity of the Americans themselves. Black soldiers worked side by side with white ones, handing out medicine, carrying stretchers, speaking German with surprising fluency. Female American nurses strode confidently through the wards, giving instructions with authority that German women had never been permitted. The Reich had taught them to expect chaos from such diversity. Instead, they saw discipline, competence, and mutual respect. The shock was almost too great to bear. Some women lay awake at night, whispering to each other, what else did they lie about? The cultural dissonance grew with each passing day. American soldiers offered the nurses coffee during long shifts, their voices casual, polite. They turned their backs when the WWII men washed, affording privacy without question. They said please and thank you. Small courtesies, but to women who had braced for degradation, they felt like revelations. Even the patients noticed. German soldiers who had once cursed the enemy now watched in silence as American medics treated them with the same care as their own. One young infantryman, his leg shattered beyond saving, murmured to Elizabeth, "Why would they do this? They should hate us." She had no answer. For the nurses, the collapse of propaganda was complete. They had been told Americans would strip them of dignity. Instead, dignity was the very thing being restored. Their hands, once expected to be punished, were entrusted with new bandages, new tools, new lives. Helga wrote later in her diary, "We thought surrender meant shame, but they gave us soap, chocolate, and bandages. They told us to keep working, as if we still mattered. I felt like a nurse again, not a prisoner." Weeks passed, and the routine solidified. German and American staff shared shifts, meals, even laughter in stolen moments. The language barrier blurred under the universal grammar of care, a gesture toward a scalpel, a nod of thanks, a weary smile after hours at a bedside. The most shocking moment came when an American officer gathered the nurses in the courtyard. Through an interpreter, he announced, "You are not our enemies. You are nurses. You will continue your duty under our supervision. You will be respected." The words washed over them like sunlight after years of shadow. Many wept openly. Revenge had been expected. Respect had been unthinkable. Yet here it was, spoken plainly, embodied daily. For the first time since the Reich's collapse had begun, the nurses dared to hope. Not for victory, not for a return to what was lost, but for survival, with dignity intact. The weeks after surrender unfolded in ways the nurses could never have imagined. The hospital, once a dim corridor of despair, was now a strange meeting ground of former enemies. German and American wounded lay in neighboring cots, their groans and murmured words blending into one chorus of pain. And at their bedsides stood the same women who had feared punishment, German nurses, sleeves rolled high, hands steady, continuing their calling. At first, the work was overwhelming. New waves of wounded arrived daily, carried in on stretchers from skirmishes at the front or collapsed towns. The Americans had medical units, but the numbers were staggering. They needed every pair of skilled hands, even those once sworn to the Reich. The order remained the same. You will keep working. And so they did. Elizabeth Bauer moved from bed to bed with practiced efficiency, her apron smudged with blood, both German and American. She had expected humiliation. Instead, she was thanked. Soldiers, men she had been told were merciless, murmured gratitude when she changed their bandages, even smiled weakly through fever. The shock of hearing "thank you" from an American throat nearly broke her the first time. It was a word she had not expected to hear for the rest of her life. The Red Cross continued to deliver supplies, each parcel another reminder that dignity was being restored, not stripped away. There were antiseptics, morphine, powdered milk for the weakest patients. The women handled these items with reverence, remembering the desperate months when even boiled bandages felt like treasure. One evening, Helga Müller stood in the storeroom staring at the shelves now stacked high with gauze, soap, clean linens. Tears read her vision. "So much," she whispered, "and we wasted years with nothing." An American nurse found her there, laid a hand on her shoulder and said simply, "It's enough now. Use it well." That night, Helga wrote in her diary, "I am still a nurse. They cannot take that from me. Not the Reich, not defeat, not even surrender." The collaboration between German and American staff deepened. Cultural barriers softened. A German nurse and an American medic might share a cigarette outside the ward, swapping halting words of each other's language. A black American orderly cracked jokes that made even the sternest German matron laugh, shattering years of propaganda with a single grin. Women who had once been taught to see only enemies began to see colleagues, even friends. The most extraordinary moment came in April, when the American commanding officer addressed the staff again. Through an interpreter, he told them, "The war is ending, but healing does not end. You are not guilty for tending to the wounded. You are honored for it." The words struck like lightning. For years, their uniforms had been symbols of complicity, proof of service to a collapsing Reich. Now those same uniforms were being redefined, not as marks of guilt, but as badges of humanity. They were nurses, first and last. And so they served. German nurses treated frostbite on American infantrymen who had crossed rivers in the snow. They stitched wounds on paratroopers who had dropped into villages still burning from battle. They held the hands of boys from Iowa and New York, just as they had held those from Munich and Hamburg. In return, American soldiers shared rations, chocolate, bread, even chewing gum that made the women laugh when bubbles popped for the first time in their lives. The hospital itself became a symbol. Outside, towns lay in ruins. Inside, enemies cared for each other. The wounded shared rise through interpreters, some whispering about farms in Bavaria, others about baseball games back home. A few even discovered distant family ties, proof that bloodlines crossed oceans in ways politics never could. But perhaps the most profound change was internal. The women who had braced for shame now rediscovered pride, not in ideology, but in service. Their hands were no longer instruments of a crumbling regime. They were instruments of survival. Greta Klein, who had once feared she would be branded guilty forever, said later, "I thought my hands were stained, but they gave me bandages and told me to keep working. And I understood our worth was not destroyed by defeat." By summer, the war in Europe was over. The Reich was gone. The nurses awaited their fates, release, interrogation, perhaps trials. But something extraordinary had happened. Their testimony, their work during those chaotic months, had already spoken louder than accusations. American officers filed reports praising their discipline, their compassion, their refusal to abandon patients even as bombs fell. When some of the women were finally dismissed from service, they left with more than freedom. They carried parcels of dignity, bars of soap tucked into bags, letters from American medics, even lipstick offered as tokens of humanity. These became relics of survival, proof that defeat had not erased them. In the years that followed, many spoke little of those days. Some married, some returned to nursing in quiet hospitals, others carried scars too deep to share. Yet among them, one memory burned bright, the moment they realized that surrender did not mean humiliation, that their identity as healers had survived, that the Americans, instead of exacting revenge, had given them the greatest mercy possible, permission to remain themselves. Decades later, Elizabeth told her granddaughter, "The Reich ended, but I was still a nurse, because an American told me, 'You will keep working.' That was my salvation." And so, the story endures, not of revenge, but of respect, not of humiliation, but of dignity restored in the most unlikely of places, a battlefield hospital in 1945 where women who expected punishment were instead given soap, bandages, and the right to heal again.